Victoria Mattingly, and I'm so thrilled to welcome you to the SIOP Conversation Series, where we talk with leading industrial organizational psychologists. This is episode number 29, and we'll be talking all about the science of a more inclusive workplace. Today, our guest discusses one of the top 10 trending topics in the field of IO psychology, ensuring inclusive environments and cultures. Welcome to the SIOP Conversation Series, Dr. Enrica Ruggs.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm super excited to be here to talk to you, another um, inclusion expert. So this is really exciting to have a great conversation with you.
I know. Whenever I saw that you were our next guest and we'll be talking about inclusion, I'm like, oh my gosh, I want to try so hard to keep my bias out of this. And
No, please, let's have a conversation. I'd love to hear what you are doing and working on too. So
I love it. I love it. So a little bit about you. I'm just gonna gas you up a little bit. Enrica is associate professor of management at the CT Bauer College of Business at the University of Houston. She received her PhD in IO psychology from Rice University and her master's from St. Mary's and her bachelor's degrees, multiple, from Prairie View and A&M University. In her research, she examines individual, organizational, and societal factors that influence inequity in the workplace, right? So these gaps between identity groups and what could be done to close them. Her work focuses on the manifestation of subtle forms of discrimination and mistreatment towards employees with stigmatized identities and the outcomes of these behaviors, as well as strategies that individuals and organizations can take to combat and reduce discrimination. She also examines the experiences of minority employees, understanding factors that influence job attitudes and psychological well-being. Her research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, which I love to hear because IO is a STEM acknowledged field now. So shout out for that. Start getting more of that grant money, IOs. Follow Enrica's lead. She also is a very accomplished author with publications in the Journal of Applied Psychology, Journal of Management, as well as what I love to see as on the scientist practitioner, on the practitioner side. Her research has been featured in media outlets like New York Times, U.S. News and World Report, Business Insider, and Fortune. So actually getting into the eyes and ears and minds and hearts of those who can implement this within organizations. She's also very involved in SIOP, and she is the incoming 2023 SIOP conference program chair. With all those accolades and accomplishments, we couldn't be happier to have you here today, Enrica. And just to start our conversation, we would just love to hear more about your journey as an IO psychologist. So how did you get into this field? What spurred your research interest, especially related to these subtle forms of discrimination and mistreatment toward employees?
yeah, oh my gosh. Well, thank you for that really lovely introduction. What spurred my journey to IO? I think it really started when I was an undergrad at Prairie View A&M, which is an HBCU. I took a class, so I was a psychology major, and like many people, psychology, you're taking all of these clinical and abnormal classes, but I happened to have one undergraduate class in IO, and I was just like, this is so cool. I really want to learn more about it. And so I went and I did a master's, and I actually thought I was going to be a practitioner who adjunct on the side. Like that was going to be my life. I was going to be an external consultant and then teach on the side. And when I was in my master's program, I really just gravitated toward the research. And so I wanted to do more of that. Went to Rice, and then the second part of that question was like around what spurred my research interest. And I really think, it's the experiences. So, for some people, research is me search a little bit. And I think that mine is some of that. And I think what probably heightened those interests was going to an HBCU in Prairie View A&M, and then also going to an HSI. So St. Mary's University is a Hispanic serving institution. HBCU is a historically Black college. University, for those who don't know. But I really just had the opportunity to hear about and see firsthand, like, so many people's experiences with various forms of discrimination and mistreatment, both subtle and also not so subtle, very overt and explicit. And just really started thinking about this. And at first, it was much broader, right? So I think I probably would have been just as happy as a social psychologist. So understanding bias and discrimination in society at large, but really thinking about, like, how does this affect people when they are at work and thinking about working experiences.
Yeah. It's so fascinating, and something I've noticed both in the bio you shared and just how you talk about your research is that you don't use the term microaggressions. And I know I've learned a little bit about how that term can actually cause more harm than good when it comes to education and awareness building, and most importantly, the actions that result. And so I'm curious, was that by design, or like, can you explain a little bit to the audience, like, what microaggressions are and why that might not be the best term to use in this space?
Yeah, and I will say, so microaggressions really refers to these sort of subtle behaviors that people engage in, that some people describe as sort of these low intensity types of behaviors. So micro insults and micro invalidation. So it's the, like, examples might be like, where are you from type of thing. And I think that there's a lot of different things that we could talk about with this. So one, I think that some of that stuff does fit into other constructs that we can talk about. But by no means do I support people who do that research, and I talk about it in my classes. But for me, I think that, a lot of the stuff isn't really micro. Um, a lot of these aggressive mistreatment behaviors are macro, even if they are what we would call subtle forms of discrimination, and the outcomes are really devastating. And so we know some of the research shows that subtle forms of mistreatment and discrimination can have outcomes that are just as damaging as overt forms of discrimination. And that's research by, my lovely colleagues, Kristen Jones out at University of Memphis, and Eden King at Rice have done work on that. And so we know that there are very real consequences to this stuff. And for me, I think that sometimes talking about it as micro can give this perception that, it's not a big deal when it really is. But, for those of you who are doing microaggression research, I think there's some really cool stuff to study in there. So, and important work.
Yeah, and I love how really differentiated between the construct and the research work rather than the applied work. And something else I wanted to call out when you were sharing about your journey, you and we completely flip-flopped. I wanted to get my PhD I saw myself as a business school professor, right? Because psych students get it. I don't need to convince psych students why they should care
Yeah.
about humans at work. I need to convince all these future leaders and managers and people that might not see the value of taking care of your people, right? So I wanted to be in a business school and then consult on the side, right? And then I flipped. And so now I'm the consultant who adjuncts and tries to contribute to research. And so I love that. I feel like it's such a good example of scientist practitioner, right? And I have students reach out all the time saying, I can't decide and which way, and how did you decide? I'm like, we need to do both, just figuring out what that balance could look like. And I know you've done some consulting work and really, brought that to life with clients and things. And I'm curious if you just have any, just like pointers or like lessons or just like stories about the consulting work you've done and how you brought some of that research into the applied world.
Yeah, I think that that's such a great point. And one of the really cool things about having a degree in IO psychology is I like to say I'm a little bit indecisive. So it really feeds that part of me. I don't have to choose just one. I get to do a little bit of both. But I think it's really important and something that we recognized as a field long ago that, bringing the research into what we're doing really in the applied space really makes sure that we are doing things that we know will work, right? Or we have strong evidence will work. And bringing that practice part into the research is also so important, right? Because, we don't want to just be out here. Or I got into this, like I said, I wanted to be a practitioner. So when I decided to um, shift a little bit, the thing that I think grounded me was I wanted to do stuff to really, this sounds very cliche as a psych student, but have an impact on people's lives,
Yeah.
right? So I wanted to do research that wasn't just in academic journals behind paywalls, but like, how do we actually do things that can change people's lives for the better? And so I think it's really important to kind of do some of that. And in terms of like, how do you do that and how do you balance it? I think for everyone it's different. There are some people who are doing a lot more consulting as
Mhm.
academics than I do. And I don't know where they find that much time, but I think that it's great. But I think, finding that balance and sometimes just carving out small projects is really important and talking to people is really important. And I think that it helps inform our research, and it helps inform like what I do because you go and you do these different consulting projects and you're like, oh, these were the questions I was going to ask, but maybe that's not quite the right question.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's really useful and important.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of this, like closing the scientist practitioner gap, DEI really has had this increased focus both in academia and practice. And, I can speak to just the work that I do with my clients, but, really this call to incorporate DEI, and by that I mean diversity, equity, and inclusion. Lots of acronyms in this space.
I know.
I always try to catch myself to define them. But given your experiences, Enrica, on the factors that influence inequity in the workplace, how can employers and organizations really start creating equitable and inclusive cultures in an evidence-based, like significant way, right? Not just these statements and talking the talk, but then no action afterwards.
Yeah, I think that's such a great and important question. And it's there's been a lot of talk about this virtue signaling or performative type of stuff. And my graduate student is doing some work on that. And I think it's really cool and important. And I think some of these organizations are, don't really know where to start. And I think the first place is really having the commitment and
Mhm.
figuring out like, is this something that we want to focus on? Because I do think that sometimes organizations will put these statements out there, but they're not really at a place where they're ready to start on this journey. Like they're not committed to the journey, and it takes a lot of work, as you know, right? We can't just go in and do these one-off 2-hour trainings and say like, all right, everything's great. Like all of our equity issues are now solved. We've done our job. It really, really takes time. And so I think, really wanting to take stock and recognize the blind spots and perhaps not blind spots, the very obvious things that are going on in-house, right? So really taking that internal look at our organization is a really good first step in being committed to wanting to drive change. And then, it's gaining the awareness of what inequity and bias looks like and how it may be manifesting in your own organization, because that may be very different. And this is where it's really important to think about that science and practice coming together. We can define microaggressions or interpersonal discrimination or incivility, but how that manifests at organization A may be very different than how it's manifesting at organization B. So really looking at like what is going on. And one of the things that I think is really important, sometimes we get stuck in sort of, this is the way we've always done things, the status quo.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
so, you know, it's often for some organizations, it's not that they want to perpetuate bias, right? Like most people don't want to perpetuate bias, but it's like, oh, well, we don't really understand, it works well. And it's like, well, maybe it works well for a certain group of people, but not for everyone.
Yeah,
So not being afraid to change that status quo. And then I think, so once we sort of take stock of where we are and really have that commitment, and that commitment, I think it's so important to have it from the top.
yeah,
So top level management and the leaders, um, gaining sort of that awareness, and then taking stock of what are the resources that we have, what are the resources that we need. So that's the human resources, the human capital that we have, the financial resources that we have, the technology resources that we have, the space, in everything that we need. And then you can do the bigger work, right? So as IO psychologists, we understand this through measurement. And I know that I'll plug you really quick, Gas. You just wrote a book about this. But really understanding like how do we measure where we're at, where we want to be, and how we get there. So getting a baseline of where we're at, understanding the data or the metrics that we want to collect and we want to track over time, figuring out how to measure and track the important things. So if we're having problems with attrition and turnover, and looking at this, so looking at not just the obvious things of gender and race, but looking at like intersectionality of these things, looking at inclusion issues. So talking to our people that are there at the organization. And sometimes that requires bringing in outside experts to help us with some of that. And then in bringing in experts to help us with designing the necessary interventions that we might need, and then tracking over time. So what's the progress that we've made? What do we need to potentially change up, right? If we're not getting to where we need to be. And I think finally thinking about, not finally, but like really thinking about and understanding that this is a journey and
yes.
it's a process, right? It takes time. New issues are going to arise in terms of inclusion or diversity and equity. And so understanding that we're constantly having to revamp and revise to ensure that we are making progress and getting to equity.
Oh, that was so rich and robust. I was taking notes. I want to make sure we
Cool.
recap that when we share out this episode in the future. And there was what you said about like tracking that progress, and something that's such a common phrase in this space is moving the needle. We need to move the needle, move the needle. How do we know if we're moving the needle if we don't measure where we're starting, if we don't have valid metrics to see where that needle stands, and then reassess to see where it's moving, if it's moving, right? And so
Yeah.
I know I'm biased. I warned my bias is going to come into this episode, but I think IO just has so much to contribute to the DEI space, especially when it comes to measurement, especially when it comes to integrating evidence-based best practices. Because there's a lot of throwing spaghetti at the wall right now. And there's a lot of hacks in this space that see it as a business opportunity. They slap DEI consultant on their name, but they don't have any sort of either scientific training or, the theory, the research. And so, I just love all those points you made. So spot on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you know, it reminds me of social psychology,
Mm,
in some ways, in that a lot of people think, "Oh, well, this is common sense. Like anybody can do this." There's no science behind it, and what we know is that there is a science behind understanding these issues. There's so much nuance. There are things that we know work better than other things. We know that there are factors that contribute to bias in different ways for different groups of people, and so there is a lot of expertise involved in the work that we do. And that doesn't mean that people can't learn it, but I think that it's important for people to understand that there is a lot of research that's out there. There are experts that have been doing this for a long time. And so educate yourself if you want to get into this space. It's so important. But yeah, I think that, you know, the other thing about tracking that I've found for organizations, I think some organizations are scared. They're scared to actually know where they're at. Um, or because, like, what does that mean?
mhm.
You
Well,
know?
and and that's pushback I get a lot too. And what I say is, your people already know this. Go on
Right.
Glassdoor. Take one of my favorite strategies is when I do executive like buy-in sessions, I put a picture, a literal screenshot of their leadership page on their website on the slide. And I say, this is the first thing people look at when they're thinking of applying for your company and saying, do I see myself succeeding at this organization? And when you see no one who looks like you on that executive leadership team, what does that say? And so and then I go, it's not about, I'm not asking you to hand over your job. I'm asking you, what can you do now to make sure that picture 5 years from now, 10 years from now looks a lot different and looks like the workforce that is coming up through the ranks and is already here, quite honestly.
Yeah. And I think that that's so important because I think, oftentimes people think, especially people who are in the majority group, so whether we're talking about race and we're talking about white people or men and white men in particular, there's this fear that it's a zero-sum game, right?
Mhm,
So if we're
mhm.
getting to equity, that means I have to give up something. And like you said, we're not asking you to give up your job and go and live in poverty or something, but we're saying, like you said, what can you do 5 to 10 years from now? And also, like, how do we think about expanding the space potentially? Like,
Yeah,
what are the new positions that we need? And also, when positions are open, like, how do we fill those in a way that increases our diversity, equity, and inclusion? One question I get asked a lot, people are always like, well, we just don't know. Like, how do you get more people of color or women into these positions? Like, we don't understand why there are these issues. And I'm like, you hire them, you go out and find them. Like, think about where you're recruiting and do we need to recruit somewhere differently? What are our selection processes? And that's where it goes back to that whole status quo thing that I was talking about. So obviously we need to do something different, and bringing in, experts or reevaluating what we're doing can really help with that.
absolutely. And once again, IOs are so qualified for this, right? Like
We are.
good
Yeah.
DEI, someone just put in the comments, succession planning. How do we develop our
Yes.
employees? How do we have competency models that set up people for success so there's clarity? It's so interesting looking at DEI data and a lot of the systemic differences we sometimes find between these identity subgroups. It's actually just good people management that certain subgroups are lacking. And that's inequity, right? But at the end of the day, if we just make sure that we take care of our people and have robust people management process throughout the entire employee life cycle, that's good DEI, and keeping in mind those individual differences. And speaking of individual differences, something else you said earlier, which I thought was fascinating, was like DEI at the individual level. Like so much of that is like acknowledging and understanding and recognizing the systemic barriers people face because of their individual differences. And as IOs, we're experts in individual differences, right? But what you said about organizations is the same deal. And it's not that we're going to come in and do the same intervention because every organization is unique. And, I've seen organizations where if you looked at the Black male population, they were actually doing pretty good compared to other identity groups. But when you split it by leader level, those first level employees were actually way less on feeling included and feeling like they belong there, right? And so you have to get into the nuances of the organization itself, the same way we would get into these nuances of individual differences. And so I love that. And that leads me to my last question. But before I get to that, for those of y'all watching out there, the nice advantage of this live stream, aside that you get the raw conversation, is the fact that you can ask questions. And so in our last, 5-10 minutes together, as Enrica answers this last question from me, throw some of your questions into the chat. Let's do a rapid fire. We have her here, so let's take advantage of her brilliance. I'm going to ask my last question, audience. You think about and start asking yours in the chat. So related to these individual considerations, a lot of our conversation has talked about the organizational level or what senior leaders can do. Let's talk about individual employees and what individual people, regardless of level, can do to combat and reduce discrimination at their organizations. So what insights and suggestions do you have for just people trying to be better humans out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's so important. That's where a lot of my research lies too. And I think, it's important for us to understand that as people, we have power. We can be the change makers. We can be those change agents. And so, what can I do if I'm experiencing mistreatment or bias or discrimination? And so, we study this a lot in terms of identity management strategies. And I'll say, I don't think the burden or the onus of responsibility should be on people who are experiencing it. But we also know that oftentimes it's live time, right? We're in an interaction, a one-on-one with somebody, and they say something that is very biased, or they engage in this behavior that leads to inequity over time. And so really thinking about what are the things that we can do. And so some of the research shows that we can engage in individuation behaviors and strategies. And so that's really providing more information about ourselves so that people see us as people, right? As individuals, and not as someone who's part of our subgroup, right? And they don't just think about us in terms of our group membership. So, oh, she's a Black woman. They now know, okay, oh, Enrica is somebody who went to Rice University and I went to Rice University. And so we have this connection. And so people are able to then think beyond the bias, so to speak. And so I think that that's one thing that we can do. Another thing that we can do if we're experiencing this in sort of live time is really ask people to, what did you mean by that? Right? So get people to stop and pause and think about what they're doing and what they're saying and their own biases, because oftentimes I think that people just aren't thinking about it, right? And so if we get people to stop and to think about it a little bit more carefully, then they're able to figure that out. And then importantly, what can we do to be allies if we're seeing people as our coworkers who are experiencing bias and discrimination? Like, how do we help them? And I love the bystander intervention model, and thinking about this in terms of prejudice reduction. So Dr. Leslie Ash Bernardo has this really great piece that is in, I'm going to get this wrong. It's in one of the academy journals, but it is how we can, it's the CPR model. So coworkers prejudice response reduction. Oh my gosh, I'm butchering that, but it's a great article that really uses the bystander intervention model to respond to prejudice. And so if we think about this from the research perspective, the first thing is being able to recognize, right, what is bias and discrimination. So if we hear somebody saying something, like, think about, is that biased? Is that prejudice? Right? Being able to recognize it, because we can't act if we don't recognize it. And then once we're able to recognize it, think about like taking responsibility. So often we see, if we think about this in the bystander intervention model, right, there's a diffusion of responsibility. So
Mhm.
thinking about what can I do? So I will be the person who takes responsibility, and then understanding how to respond to that. And so other things that I think we can do is attend to our own blind spots. And so we all have bias, um, even the experts, right? Like I have biases. We all do. And so understanding what our blind spots are and really being intentional
Mhm.
about being better people. Um, Learning about others is really important. So educating ourselves, and not just through like, hey, you are a member of the LGBTQ community, like tell me everything about it. But like going and doing our own work in that space, listening and practicing empathy. So research shows that empathy is so important. Empathy helps to reduce prejudice and to increase positive attitudes. And so, if we're able to really listen to other people and, you know, practice perspective taking, so we know that this works to help reduce prejudice, because sometimes there's a tendency to say, well, that doesn't happen to me, or I've never experienced that. So it's clearly not happening. But putting ourselves in somebody else's shoes and saying, if this was my experience, how would I feel? That really helps to build empathy. And empathy is so important. There's tons of research out there on that. Um, I think we can also insist on accountability, right? So be the voice, speak up, ask questions when other people aren't in the room, saying, being that voice. Why aren't they in the room?
Yeah.
Um, how does this decision that we're making affect the vulnerable employees? Has anybody talked to these different ERGs and
Mhm.
understood how the, this decision might affect people within this community? Um, and just, yeah, so really speaking up and being those culture changers, because earlier I talked about top management being really important, because I think we need the top down, but we also need that bottom up, right? So if we're all speaking up, we have more influence than we think. We can create the social norms and the culture that we want within our organization. We can be the people who say, you know what, I don't think that that joke is funny. I think that's inappropriate. We can speak up, like I said, and say like, why are there no women in the room? Right? Like, I think that's a problem.
Yeah.
Um, we can speak up and say, if we see somebody cut off a woman, we see a man cut off a woman, like, actually, hold on. Like, can we go back? I really want to hear what Victoria has to say. So just thinking about this every day. And I'll say, so Dolly Chug has this book that I just love.
I
Um,
love it. I have it right here. I know
I
exactly what you're
do.
about to say. It's so good. I recommend
Thank
it
you
to like
for, yeah,
everyone who wants to be an ally because it's
yeah.
just so, so good. It's so good. Oh,
It's so good. I just think there's lots of great nuggets in there. So yeah.
I love it. Yeah, Dolly Chug. I'll drop the link in the chat there. And unfortunately, it's so sad. We are out of time for today.
I'm
And
sorry that
no,
it's been-
no, this is great. I love filling up all of our time with brilliant content and giving people and organizations and leaders the tools they need based on science to build more inclusive workplaces. Because even though I know it's the market and the space is blowing up right now, we're already seeing some of that momentum begin to fizzle. And what I loved about our conversation today were so many things that you recommended can be built into the organization structure, into people processes, into how they collect data and use data. And that way, whenever the next people operations fad comes out, we can make sure that we have DEI embedded into those people processes. So to our podcast listeners, our live listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. Enrica, on behalf of SIOP, all of our listeners out there, our members, thank you so much for such an engaging and enlightening conversation and just taking the time to share your workplace inclusion expertise with us today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. This was a great time. Please invite me back in the future. I love this, and I'd love to have more conversations with you about the science and the practice and how we can all work together to make better workplaces for everyone, because that's really what it's all about, right? Like creating more inclusive and equitable spaces for everyone.
And how can we connect across this divide right here, right? Like how can we have more academic and practitioner partnerships, right? Because I'm swimming in data, but I have no incentive to publish. And I know so many academics struggle getting the organization data. So like match made in heaven. So we'll talk more after today. Well, I see collaboration opportunities. But thank you all again for joining us. Please join us for our next live conversation on Thursday, July 28th, same time at 11:15 a.m. Eastern Time. Thank you again for joining us today. We look forward to seeing y'all back here soon. And until next time, take care and be sure to think about ways that you can build a more inclusive workplace using science to do so.
Thank you.
Thank you.